Hello and welcome to Hair in the Hawthorn. And yet again, we have the lack of the Dr. Neil Rushton with us this evening. I have said this before, but he's actually told me off quite badly for telling people that he's scared of the spookier side of things, and wanted me to let you know that he is slightly lost in the Bermuda Triangle after trying to get to the Caribbean on a long haul ship from the UK. It's up to you to make up your mind whether that's true or not. But he will be back very, very shortly when we talk about the fairies, which he's much more okay with. So he's not scared of the spookier side at all. He's in the Bermuda Triangle.
Yeah.
So I'm going to leave it there. So today's guest, I've got a massive pleasure of welcoming on a guest that I had the pleasure of meeting face to face at Parameet this year, which, if you know, I do go on about Parameet. It's such a lovely occasion where the paranormal peeps get together and basically have a really good time and exchange ideas. So I'm going to get I have said your name, Kate, your surname so many different ways in my head, and I've got a dyslexic
Yeah.
fixation. So I'm going to go for Cheryl. Cherrell?
10 out of
Cheryl.
10. You got it
Woohoo!
right. Perfect.
Brilliant.
Flawless.
Brilliant, brilliant. Because I've gone for Cherrell, just
Yeah.
okay, brilliant. So we've
Yeah.
got the
They want Cherrelle. They want me to sound far classier than I really am. And I appreciate that. But
you
in
should
reality, I'm from Grimsby, so it's Cheryl.
all the best. Well, I was going to say all the best people come from Grimsby, but didn't Margaret Thatcher come from Grimsby? Was
No,
she?
she was from Grantham. She's
Oh,
Grantham. We're not claiming her. We've had some bad uns, but
oh,
yeah,
I better
it's
shut up very, very quickly before I offend everybody over the county border and they come storming into Nottinghamshire and shoot me down.
yeah.
So we met at Parameet, and I think it was the first time that we actually had a good chance to have a catch up. And I think one of the things that stuck in my mind, other than the work that you do and listening to you give your talk, was that we seem to have a yin yang little dog thing going off, don't we? It's like
Yeah.
you've got this lovely, beautiful gothic persona about you, and you've got this absolutely cutesy little white dog. Whereas I've got more of the fairy persona, and I've got this cutesy little black dog. You know, they're the
Yeah.
kind of twins from a different side. Anyway, I'm going to stop rambling. It's lovely to have you on board, and thank you so much for joining us.
Oh,
Um,
thank you for having me.
you're welcome. I am super interested to get into the brass tacks of who you are, sort of what makes you tick. And I think I'm going to be asking questions that are kind of cheeky in a way that I want to know more than I think, and I know the viewers will want to know as well. So I think
Okay.
the first thing is I'm fascinated about your doctorate. Can you talk us through a little bit about your doctorate?
Right. Okay. Well, I got my doctorate in 2012. Seems like yesterday. But I was focusing on this. Doctorates are so complicated. They sound exciting, and in reality, they're so precise and so very dull. I was looking at female mediumship
Mhm,
in the Gothic. So, kind of academically speaking, I've always sort of gone for the Victorian Gothic angle of things in terms of literature.
mhm,
Everything's very, very literature based. So I've been looking at periodicals and genre fiction of the time, and this really interesting subset of fiction in like the mid to late 19th century, where a lot of clergy, a lot of prominent religious people would write a small amount, granted, but these anonymously
mhm,
authored novels that were about the dangers of spiritualism and this redemptive arc of a woman falling to the sin of being a public persona and being a spiritual vessel, and then is ultimately cured at the end by marriage and a return to everything that is good and right. So within my whole sort of academic realm, I've had these little rabbit warrens, but I've always been very interested in how female mediums are represented in fiction, really, and in genre fiction. And after the PhD, because I was mainly looking at 19th century, I've sort of I've expanded my academic obsessions, my heavy reading obsessions. And so now I'd sort of class myself more as just a broad sort of cultural historian when it comes to seance and mediumship, broadly spiritualism, I suppose. So now, after looking so far into how especially young female mediums were represented in the 19th century in periodical culture, in newspaper reports, and in genre fiction, how, as a society, certainly in America and in the UK, we've taken these reports of mediumship, of miraculous young girls channeling the dead and ancient wisdom, and we've turned those into tropes for continuous genre fiction. So at the minute, I'll eventually get up to modern day, but at the minute, I'm completely obsessed with like 60s, 70s, 80s paperbacks, like
Okay.
proper lurid horror paperbacks about
Mhm.
like young female mediums and how they're a corruptive force on all the men around them, and that they're made monstrous via puberty, and how ultimately, although it seems like super duper tacky and buckets of blood sort of stuff, ultimately we can still trace that back to the way that we've always spoken about women in mediumship.
Mm.
So that's kind of academically where I stand. So from the PhD, I indulged my 19th century Gothic obsession, and then I took that on to another master's in Victorian Gothic because I'm a sucker for punishment and certificates. And then after that, I've sort of carried on doing more academic-y kind of visuals into how we look at women. It's how women
Mm.
broadly are represented in things that aren't necessarily spiritualism, but are spiritualism parallels to spiritualism. So things like broad female mediumship, and the way that right up into the 80s and 90s we'd see these news reports on young women in some far-flung community being hailed as this amazing spiritual, paranormal, supernatural power, and how they were both condemned and celebrated because of their youth, their beauty, their ability to be a vessel and not a real person. So in 1,000 words or less, that's kind of my academic background.
I mean, that sounds fascinating. It almost sounds like where witchcraft left off, and the kind of feelings and taboos and motifs of witchcraft, it
Mm,
kind of jumped into that spiritualism, and that era where women had this power of the other world
mm,
that they could wield, and yet it made them very, very vulnerable, didn't it, to not only
yeah,
religion, but on I would assume on a sexual level as well, made them quite vulnerable in that situation. Did you find that
absolutely.
that things changed quite dramatically in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, or was this the same kind of themes running through how they were portrayed, how they were received, and that kind of thing?
I think really the parallels that can be drawn between, say, like the 1970s and the 1870s are pretty strong, because there was still the fear of, this is certainly in American literature,
Hmm.
um, a woman in a place of power, a woman in a place of conspicuous authority, and it's always conspicuous
Hmm.
authority. So that's a woman on a stage, particularly people like trance performance mediums. A woman in a position of conspicuous authority is a dangerous woman.
Hmm.
And then from that, you can extrapolate what she's a danger to. She's a danger to social, societal norms. She's a danger to gender norms, to
Hmm.
sexual norms. Because if we upend the natural order of things, of men predominantly holding power, and certainly you can mimic it with churches, men holding, these prominent clerical positions, then a woman comes in and that flips everything we know. And so if it just flips one of those major tenets of something that we need to establish our safe, godly existence, then we start to be concerned as a
Mm.
community about what else can this corruptive force influence. So I think we can even see it in pop stars, or in films. In films, I was speaking the other day. This does link, I promise. I'm not going off on a weird tangent about the Twilight films.
Hmm.
So sparkly vampires, all of that. And I personally will defend those films and books to the hilt, but not necessarily because I think that they're wondrous works of filmmaking and literature. I really don't. But the discourse that was surrounding certainly the release of the films was predominantly a certain group of men, again with a conspicuous platform, attacking a product aimed for and made for young women.
Mm,
And so it seemed like an attack on Twilight, but it was an attack on women.
mm,
And so I feel it might get people's goat, but I do think that from the 19th century through to the 70s and even through to today, there's still that thread that women in positions of mysticism or conspicuous authority, or even when we bring that conspicuous authority through to like mass media and mass market paperbacks, that's something that we fear because
mm.
it's an upending, it's a flip of everything that we hold to be normal and safe. And so we see these things as a threat to ourselves. And then,
That,
a threat to our communities, a threat to our families, a threat
our
to
children.
Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
everything. It's always, what somebody think of the children? I mean, that that argument is as old as the sun.
Yeah, I mean
But
it is quite bizarre, and it did come about, and from, I'm sure this is a really reductionist sort of viewpoint, but it did come about from the Christianity sort of going to the four winds. And but prior to that, you've got ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, and they would have had, and all those kind of old societies, even paganism, where women were absolutely revered with those skills and those powers. So if you had seers or muses or whatever, they were literally held up in society, weren't they? I mean,
mm,
they were feared. There was a fear factor around them. But
yeah,
come the Industrial Revolution, especially sort of the UK and movement over to America, it was like all things that came with spiritualism. You've got, fairies and Conan Doyle and blah de blah, and it just so juxtaposed to
yeah,
sort of Christianity at that time. Can I ask
yeah.
what is the kind of I'm fascinated about this, honestly.
No,
Uh,
I'm happy to natter. It's fine.
Brilliant. So what is the kind of portrayal when it is
Mhm,
men within these pieces of literature that take on
mhm,
seances or channeling or mediumship? What are they sort of
mhm.
stereotyped as well, or
The men writing about women or the men inhabiting those positions?
inhabiting those positions? It would just be nice to get a flavour
Yeah,
of if it's just the spiritualist
yeah,
aspect, or if it is
yeah.
a gender aspect as well, which I'm sure it is.
I think there certainly is a gender aspect to it. And when we look into sort of like 19th century, certainly periodical culture, because magazine culture is not a modern thing. The Victorians took magazine culture to stupid levels.
Mm,
But within those, that's because there were so many different contributors and so many people coming from different viewpoints. So if two different people were talking about one individual medium, regardless of their gender, in the same publication, you could, in theory, have people completely condemning them and condemning their abilities and saying they're a fraud and having this big slagging match in the letters to the editor. Or
mhm,
you could have someone else saying, I am a anonymous man of standing in the local community. I listened to this trance lecture for 3.5 hours last Saturday, and it was the most profound thing I've ever experienced in my life. So there's always going to be that duality.
mhm,
But certainly looking through periodicals of the late Victorian period, I found there's a really interesting mix of the way we talk about bodies. So
mhm,
the men, even in some of the books that I mentioned earlier, like there's a book called Zilla, Child Medium, and Maud Blount. And both of those have really interesting, they're both written by men, and they're both written really interestingly because the women who are just on the precipice of becoming mediums are described as very vulnerable, very frail, very doll-like, very pure. They're so pale you can hold them up to
mhm,
the sun and see their maker's mark, that sort of thing. Whereas the women that have crossed over that boundary that are active mediums,
mhm,
there's some really interesting language used in Zillow where they're described as like Jezebels. They've got raven black hair. They're sort of these fallen women that are kind of a bit like actresses, but because they're in spiritualism, there's something a little bit woo-woo. So they're like a mold in the spiritual landscape. Whereas a lot of discourse about men by these same authors and within late Victorian periodicals, they're either described in very factual matters, like he was a tall man wearing a black suit, and he looked fine.
Mm-hmm.
Or he was, in one instance, there's one where a male medium is described as almost spider-like and quite spindly, but that's kind of the harshest descriptions you get of men. There are huge attacks on their character, certainly when you've got things like the Henry Slade trial, when a medium was taken to court for fraudulent activities, for want of a better term, and he was, you know, described as Mr. Sludge and all the rest of it. So but that was all really attacks on his claimed abilities, his personality, his educational level, whereas discourse around women, certainly in periodical culture, is very, very focused around the physicality. So she's dainty, she's delicate, she's childlike. We validate and we endorse her spiritual abilities, her ability as a spiritual catalyst, because she is young, she's pious, she's beautiful. She can't possibly be deceptive because she makes for a perfect channel. She isn't a whole person. She sort of transcends herself to become a mouthpiece for something else. And that's also how we kind of explain away this discomfort at having a young woman in a position of authority, because she's not really a young woman in a position of authority. She's transcended herself. She's now other. So she can inhabit this and we won't be too wobbly about it. It'll be fine. Whereas a lot of older mediums are described in more graphic terms. You get a lot of discussion about fat and how stocky and substantial these women are and how old they are, whether or not, and if you see pictures of them, you just think that's a woman. You're making them out to be this grotesque ogre, and it's just an older woman. But similarly, these descriptions of their bodies can be used in a certain way to endorse their spiritual abilities. So they're pious, beautiful, they're great because they can't be deceptive, brilliant. These are old, they're non-sexually viable anymore. They're kind of like the old hag at the end of the spectrum. So that's fine. They are also going to be super spiritually viable because they don't need to impress us. It's their sexual potential and their sexlessness that makes them viable. But at the same time, they can be condemned and celebrated in the same language. It just depends on who's writing about them. And so I find that really interesting that we've continued that language about how we talk about female mediums and female bodies. Like even now, when you read descriptions of female mediums who were in like tabloids and things like that, there'll always be a comment on what they look like, how they're dressed. And you'll see that far more, there might be a passing comment to a male medium wearing a white suit and looking like Marty Hopkirk, or a more modern reference. I can't think of one.
No.
There's about 4 people still alive that remember Randall and Hopkirk. But the language that's used to describe the women is usually far more verbose and far more loaded than it is to describe male mediums. And I think you're right. I think as well that the way that certainly North American Christianity has peaked and flowed. So when we get tent revivals in the late 19th century in America, we get this huge uptick of writing about the destructive power of young female mediums. And then it all sort of, things change a lot in wartime. We get really interesting discussions of women's bodies in the UK, people like Helen Duncan, who, you know, she could cough up half a dozen ghosts, but people will still be going, oh, she's a bit heavy though, isn't she? It's like, yes, well done. Right, now what about this ectoplasm? You know, it's like, oh, her phenomena is almost secondary to how fit she is, which another thing I can waffle on about for hours. But then certainly in the 60s, in the 50s, 60s and 70s in America, where you get charismatic Christianity, charismatic Christianity, and this big revival in sort of like glossolalia, like religious phenomena that's led by the Holy Spirit, that suddenly, while there's an uptick in that sort of, well, charismatic, overboard, very performance-based Christianity, there's also, this mirrors the massive uptick of interest in the occult. So there'll be Sharon screaming in tongues going, oh, Christ is with me, in one room, and then a daughter will be in the other room with a Ouija board and half naked with her friends trying to contact, you know, some ancient evil. So I think it's really interesting that and through it all, while men may still be the preachers and while men may still be the head of different occult groups, it's the women who we are most interested in, and the women who we talk about in the most loaded in the most loaded language.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting going back to, you saying about the young girls and how they're talked about, and then you've got the older sort of, and you did mention the crone stage. It's almost like we have the maiden and the crone, and there's a gap in the middle, isn't there, for the mother, for that age
Yeah.
group that it does seem to be missing. I was trying to rack my brains then about, photographs that I've seen of famous mediums over that period of time, and even now, and it's either the
Mm,
very, very young, and like you say,
mm,
innocently presented, or those who are, almost hardened looking women, aren't they? They're kind of, they
yeah.
don't, it's like they don't give a crap anymore. Not about, but about how, what people think of them. It's like, this is
Mm,
what I do and this is what I present. And even when I think about modern mediums, it's like there is an age gap that's kind of missing from that work. And it's
yeah.
well, why do you think that is? Why do you think there's that kind of lack of, I would say probably 30-year-olds around kind of either side of
Yeah.
that, sort of being revered as mediums?
I think you kind of hit the nail on the head with that, just calling it that mother period,
Mm,
because certainly for centuries, it was sort of seen that spiritualism was almost something as a medium was something you gave up, like
mm,
you put down your toys and you give up childish things. It was that you put down spiritualism, you marry, you become a mother, and that becomes your role now. And to be
mm,
an active medium, to be a working mother, because a lot of these women, if they weren't held on a retainer by very wealthy businessmen who would be their patrons and
mm,
basically just have access to them whenever they want, um, then it wasn't especially viable. So although you do have these outliers, you do have women that continued their career for decades and went around the world and really established themselves. The majority of women who were working mediums and private mediums who would rent rooms and give readings, it's weird societally because we at that point when a woman becomes a mother, that purpose um supersedes everything else, every spiritual purpose. If the week before we'd said she's a great medium, go and see her, if now she's pregnant
mm,
and she's going to be a medium, that shows a complete distrust for her as a mother and also as an ethical, a viable, a holy woman.
mm,
So I think really we don't think about this middle ground because in reality, a lot of people dropped out of it. People
mm,
that weren't able to financially support themselves, because a lot of it is purely down to finances. So it's frustrating, but there are several there are numbers of women throughout
mm,
history who did did maintain, but I would argue that it was the ones that were held on monthly retainers from patrons.
mm,
So that's singular, like Florence Cook, one of the most famous child mediums of the 19th century, who did carry on being a medium for a while. There was a big lecture circuit at the time, so a lot of these mediums, you think, oh, they've disappeared out of the British press for 20 years. They were probably in Australia. They were zipping around a lot, but she was able to do a lot of what she did in the early days because she had the support of a singular patron called Charles Blackburn, who was a very
mm,
successful Manchester businessman. And I think it was found in a few of her papers that when she first married, that information was held back a bit from
yeah,
Blackburn, just because it was seen that a lot of these young mediums, if suddenly they married, they were women now. They were
yeah,
someone else's and they were spiritually impure because of their sexual potential. And so I think aside from seaside fortune that far more of a like a Romany tradition, yeah, there is a big drop off, and it's I think social expectations of motherhood and what true motherhood and true womanhood, which was a very popular mindset at the end of the century,
mm,
what they expect of women. It's the idea of men marrying women and wanting the angel of the home. They want
yeah,
someone who's keeps the home nice, gets everything ready when they're home, looks after the children, like the perfect Victorian housewife. And that housewife doesn't especially allow um, for mediumship and active employment. And this
Mm.
happened right into there's a friend of mine who's a tarot reader, a medium. He's very, very good. And his family were all the women in his family were all active tarot readers. And this was probably like 60s, like 50s, 60s, 70s. And systematically, each of those women gave up their craft on the request of their other half, on the request of their husband, because it was seen as socially improper and it would
Mm.
make things a bit awkward for them as a family within their community if the woman was seen to be actively participating in card reading, mediumship, anything that fell under sort of an esoteric banner.
Mm. I think, yeah, I completely understand that, because there was possibly that kind of overarch of, in league with the devil. And if a woman's got children under that, if she's on her own, that's okay. She can be in league of the devil and give readings to the community. But having
Yeah.
children, it's you're under scrutiny then, aren't you, about, are you a good
Mm.
mother if you still
Yeah.
partake in that occult nature. We have deviated. I've got loads to get through.
Oh,
I
sorry.
No, no, no. It's absolutely fascinating. Absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure we'll come back to it. But we kind of started off this with getting to know you,
Oh,
and
yeah. Hi.
yeah, yeah. Um, that's the doctorate.
Mm.
That from then, sort of peeling it back.
Mhm.
So there's this passion with you about the sort of the Gothic. Is that the Gothic as a whole kind of thing? Art, literature, aesthetics, everything about it.
Yeah.
What started that? What kind of did? Can you remember a moment where you just went, yeah, I like that. That's kind of me.
I think it was a Venn diagram slowly coming together. It just seemed that naturally all of my interests were going to intersect at some point. But I mean, I grew up going around cemeteries twice a week, every week, with the same grandparent that was obsessed with ghosts and aliens. So,
Wow,
I mean,
that's
yeah,
great to have a family member to introduce you to
it's
that.
cool. Yeah, it's a bit frustrating because he died quite a long time ago now.
Hmm.
And so I'd have loved to have known him as I am now and be
Hmm.
like, "Hey, look what you made."
Yeah.
So I'm just hoping that he's looking down from another plane, going,
I did
"Thank you,
that.
and I'm sorry. You could have been a paramedic if I hadn't have given you that book on Roswell." So there's, I think, like funerary architecture and seeing the um, yeah, cemetery architecture and chapels and mortuary chapels, and then I was at and I was into I attended a choir school for a few years. Um, and with that, it was a Church of England choir school, and with that, there was regular visits to church, obviously, lots of choral stuff and lots of requiems because they do a lot of public events for requiems. And if you're in one of the choirs, you'd learn, Mozart, Rutter, all of this, and perform in what's now Grimsby Minster.
Mhm.
And I think really delving into kind of like the rather threatening, hellish Latin
Yeah.
in a lot of requiems kind of stuck with me. And
Mhm.
then with that, I mean, I started seeing people dressing in black in the town centre and thought, oh my God, they are the coolest people I've ever seen in my life.
Mhm.
And when this is not particularly cool, but when Marilyn Manson first came onto the scene, and I'd saw the first Manson video. This before I got into proper goth,
Mhm.
I started listening to Sisters, Bauhaus, and got really heavily into Rosetta Stone and Specimen and things like that. I saw Marilyn Manson and thought, oh my God, that is me now. I'm sorry. I'm going to go and buy some eyeliner from Boots and throw away all my Tammy Girl clothes. This is my
Mhm.
new identity. So it seemed like a lot of the lyrics that then led on from that, like I got really into Cradle of Filth.
Mhm.
And for, whether or not you appreciate that kind of music, a lot of the early lyrics in Cradle of Filth are incredibly gothic. They're
Mhm.
referencing a lot of gothic literature, a lot of folklore. They're amazingly written, they're really beautifully written. But it was through looking into a lot of Cradle of Filth lyrics, even like one of my favorite Cradle of Filth songs. I'm so glad you asked. Was
What's your favourite
Um,
Cradle of Filth song?
oh, thank you so much. It is Born in a Burial Gown. But in that, it references Brocken's Peak. It's like her eyes revealed as Brocken's Peak tried once concealing hell. And
Mhm.
so little me was like, what? Well, I don't know what Brocken's Peak is, but I need to know because Mr. Danny Filth seems to think it's important.
Yeah.
And so it was delving into that then I got to Brocken's Peak, and then it was like, oh, Harry Price did some weird stuff on top
Mm.
of Brocken's Peak. And so it was a weird mix of being obsessed with Gothic literature and ghost stories, and then the paranormal,
Mhm.
and then spending a lot of time in churches. And even now, I'm obsessed with churches. Whenever I pass a church, I add a couple of hours onto my journey because I
Mhm.
have to go and I have to document it. And I document the full church and all the gravestones for my Patreon because there are other people out there who are just as dull as I am.
It's
And
not dull
yeah,
at all. It's not dull.
well, I think churches are fascinating because they are like hotbeds of history. They're amazing
Mm.
places. And so I think all of those things, and then Mr. Danny Filth did his part, and then a lot of early symphonic Gothic metal did its part. And it all just coalesced until I sort of made it my academic purpose
Mm.
after it was certainly after I did my first undergrad. My first undergrad was just in English,
Mhm.
but when I could finally specialize and say, this isn't a phase, mum.
Yeah.
Now all aspects of the Gothic are a kind of my identity, and I like that. I find it um very grounding and
Mm.
very, very satisfying that it's something that's been with me for so long that I feel very comfortable
Mm.
in myself and my interests now. But yeah, they've all just sort of come from different directions, but it seemed like it was meant to be.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I think one thing that people, especially the early sort of goth music that went off,
Mm,
people who've never listened to it before, and I had a brief spat, I think, when I was a very young teenager, sort of 12, 13, it was Fields of Nephilim and that kind of thing. But the intelligence level
mhm.
of that music and sort of Marilyn Manson as well, he was like
Yeah,
mind-blowingly clever. I'd seen him in interview and how utterly distraught he would look at interviewers like, you have no idea,
yeah,
about the world and very, very clever man. So these were bands where our parents would listen to him go, oh, what are they listening to? They're going to jump off the nearest bridge. But actually, you've got
yeah,
all this kind of beauty and romance, and there is that dark overtone to it, but it absolutely beautiful stuff. I mean, it's been a long time since I've listened. I went a bit down the romantic road and went sort of
mhm.
all about Eve kind of
I was
veered.
going to say, was it all about Eve, and then it just sort of
Yeah.
went down into a very magic-y hedge? I
Yes,
can,
that's the one.
yeah,
Very, very folksy. I went very off on a
yeah,
tangent of
I,
sort of
I can appreciate that. I think, All About Eve is a gateway drug. Before you know it, you're
it
mainlining
is.
Clannad and
No,
Marillion,
no,
and
no,
then
no,
it's
no,
all,
no, no, no. I did Marillion and I did Fish, but
yeah,
Clannad, I was like, no, these are a bit too,
really?
yeah, they're a bit too clean for me. They sounded
Oh,
too
wow.
too professional. I think that's what I
Yeah.
didn't like about Clannad. They were
Hmm.
too clean. They didn't have that sort of dirty edge to them.
Oh, okay,
So
I can appreciate that.
before I get myself into trouble with viewers who like Clannad, I'm really sorry. I'm sure they're brilliant and float your boat. Yeah. So from that, what I want to do
Hmm.
is I'm one of my big things is I like to I'm fascinated by people's experiences,
Hmm.
and I don't think I've come across anybody in this kind of field, in the field of the paranormal, that hasn't started opening Pandora's boxes without something occurring that they've not been able to explain, or especially if you're going around graveyards on a regular basis
Mm.
and those kind of spiritual places. What kind of experiences have you had?
For all my time in cemeteries and graveyards, and I worked in a cemetery as well for a time.
Mhm.
So when you see these memes on Facebook and it's like, would you spend the night in a cemetery for a
It's like,
million
yes.
pounds? It's like, I've spent it overnight in a cemetery for minimum wage. Of course I'd
Yeah,
spend
yeah.
it.
For free. You've
Um,
done it for free.
yeah, yeah. So, oh God, yeah, I've spent it all in a branded fleece. But yeah, it was a torch. But for all my time in burial spaces and places of remembrance, I haven't courted either. I haven't
Mhm.
courted and I haven't had any particularly profound spiritual experience. I've had senses of peace, and on one or two occasions, there was one particular burial ground that I started feeling like, oh, you need to go now. You need to go now. And I can't explain that. There was no voice or apparition or anything. It was just, this doesn't feel right with you. I don't know why it doesn't, but leg it.
Yeah.
But a lot of a lot of my most profound experiences, certainly supernatural experiences, happened long before I was even involved in paranormal investigation in any capacity. I've probably mentioned it loads, but I've only really been talking about it for like the last year or so. But growing up, I spent a lot of time at my sister's house, and my sister had bought. So to set the scene, this is very, very glamorous. It's about 2001 in Grimsby. And my sister and her husband had just bought what they described as their first grown-up house. My sister is like 11 years older than me. And strangely enough, at her age, I hadn't bought my own house, but we'll leave economy to another time. But she'd bought this house, and they were giving a fixer-upper. And because my mum worked a lot, and because of different circumstances, I spent a lot of time in my bedroom. I had an assigned bedroom at my sister's house. And they were only there for about 3-4 years. And during that period, we experienced a gradual but very severe increase of paranormal activity, what I now comfortably call paranormal activity. But for years, literally, like last year was the only time I sat down with my sister and we went, we need to unpack all of this, because I need to write it down, because we can't forget it, because this has impacted us so much. But for years we just called it the weird house, and then we didn't discuss it. But it was over a long period of time in this house. It started with like a smell of burning. A lot of it was upstairs, most of it started upstairs, and we had sounds at night. But because both me and my sister had previously lived in bungalows, we started thinking, oh well, it's just the sounds that it was a semi, this is the sounds they make. And then it started escalating into seeing weird flashes of light around the house, but like slashes of light that would be like that very large, a few foot high, and move as if someone was walking up and down the stairs and across the landing. And we'd see them in the day and at night. So it wasn't as if it was just cars passing by or anything. And none of us were really ooky spooky, weirdy at the time. We were just very normal. My sister was a nurse. Her husband was a gas engineer. So usually one of the first things is, oh, did you get the gas checked? Like, yes, the whole house was redone, rewired, and the gas was sorted. It was Corgi registered. But yeah, it started from smells and this to then footsteps. And the footsteps are the one thing that, however much I try and debunk my own experiences, it's the one thing that I can never explain away. Even if I say everything else was because I was young, because of hormones, because of X, Y, Z. But we started getting footsteps, like heavy, purposeful footsteps, up and down the stairs, across the landing, and there was 3 bedrooms. One was an office. It was tiny, but it was through the 2 main bedrooms. And then back, and it would do this circuit. And I would scream and wake my sister up in the middle of the night, and they were so sick of me. But I started seeing and hearing it first, because my bedroom looked straight out onto the landing, and then the stairs were there, and they had a little dog at the time. They had a little Westie, and she would sit at the top of the stairs for hours at night and watch the footsteps as if there was someone walking around. And so when it went into my room, she'd watch, and it would do the loop. And so although I can explain, if it was just the footsteps, I probably wouldn't be sat here now recounting it. I'd just be thinking, oh, that your mind plays tricks on you when you're nervous as a child. But the dog was seeing it as well, and she would growl at things, and she would follow it, and she would bark at it. But it all ultimately escalated until one day we started seeing like a bit of a person, like the side of an arm and a bit of a leg just moving into. It started off in my bedroom, just walking into my bedroom from the bathroom. And then we started seeing more of it upstairs until it was like half a person or you just hear a footstep and a door would move.
Mm.
And before long, we were seeing, like, I saw this full outline of a man. It was a man in a suit with like a sort of trilby hat. I
Mm.
wasn't being haunted by the Blues Brothers. It might sound like it, but there was a man in the
Mm.
room, and he was there for 2 minutes. So it wasn't
Wow.
just like, oh, I blinked and he was gone. He was there for a decent amount of time.
Mm.
And there was that burning smell with it. And then I was told constantly that I was imagining things, I was seeing things, and then it started happening quite badly to my sister. And both her, one night she woke up all of a sudden and saw the man like stood at the side of her bed staring at them. And she looked over to her husband, who is the most rational
Mm.
person in the world, who it doesn't suffer fools gladly, and he was bolt upright as well. And they were both staring at this man, and he was there for like 30 seconds to a minute and then faded. And so on that occasion, they both said, right, say on three, what did you see? And they both said, there's a man in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And then it seemed like after they'd seen him, things escalated and things started moving around the house. The bangs, the footsteps got louder. On one occasion, a couple of books that had been on the bedside table were thrown across the room, like fully
Mm.
lifted and launched um, into a wardrobe door. And then gradually it just started moving all around the house, and it was unbearable. And we'd see him in the bathroom, he'd be stood in the bath.
No.
And so we ended, it was horrible. Even it took me probably about 10 years to be able to go into a bathroom myself and take my time and not just
Yeah.
run in and leg it. Um, but it got so bad and so severe that I stopped sleeping there,
Mm-hmm.
and my sister moved downstairs because you just couldn't sleep upstairs because there was a man running, like banging around the house at all hours of the day, throwing things, moving things. And they moved their mattress downstairs, and they put the house on the market within 3 years because they started stripping it and redoing it all to make it a long-term home. But it just wasn't viable. And so with all that, there's always people always say, oh, why didn't you call the SPR? Why didn't you call so and so and get it investigated? It's like, it's very easy to say that when you're inside this bubble, when you know those things exist. But when you're a normal person, this is pre-most haunted,
Mm-hmm.
when you don't know about anything like that in kind of the public psyche, they didn't want to put it in the paper because
Mm-hmm.
most people don't want that type of attention. They had they called out the church. There was a local vicar and his sort of deliverance team. They came round, I think, twice. Um, First occasion, it worked for about a week. Second occasion, it worked for half an hour. And then it came back, the banging, the knocks, the lights, the slamming, everything. It was horrific. Um, so I think from that, I it took me a long time to get into paranormal investigation. And even
Yeah.
now I'm quite trepidatious now. It goes in pockets. Sometimes I'm
Mm.
super duper keen and I'm like, yeah, let's go see what's in here. And other times I'm like, I can't deal with that right
Mm.
now because I think as well, it sounds so extreme. It sounds so silly and so severe. And that's fine. If you think I'm just a lunatic from a lunatic family, that's fine. But the trauma that certainly myself and my sister, um, like my sister's husband is very much man.
Mm.
We will not discuss these things. But me and my sister really struggled
Mm.
for many years afterwards. We went through phases of being really religious,
Mm.
seeing where like different churches would baptize us to just keep us safe from
Mm.
this. And it was horrific. It was really, really bad. So I think having those really scary experiences kind of put me off active investigation for a long time.
Yes.
So I'm loath to be sat in a room screaming at a creek when you think,
Yeah.
okay, well that's interesting, but thank God there's not that
Yeah.
bloke's not come back.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I suppose that's my most extreme, and that's the one that kind of is constant in the background, and that affects my mood
Yes.
and what's going on,
I can
what's going on
totally
with it. And yeah.
I can totally resonate with that. I lived for just under 13 years on my own in a very haunted property. And this was pre sort of the paranormal world for me. And like
Mm.
you say, when I didn't know that you could call paranormal people in. I
Yeah.
didn't even think at the time to call the church in. I didn't talk to anybody about it because I felt like if I talked to people, it would escalate, and it did when I spoke about
Mm.
it. Um, and if it hadn't have been that, other family members who were in the property had experiences, friends had experiences, and I told none of them anything that had happened or occurred in that house because I was terrified of even talking about it and how that affects you. I mean, for me at the time, it affected my mental health so badly.
Mm.
I felt very drained and very ill for the entire time of living in that property. And it does leave a scar, but I think I flipped back the other way now, where I was like, I got to a stage in my life where I'm going to face this and I'm going to make
Yeah.
sure that there is nothing that this realm of the dead can do to me
Mm.
that I can't fight back. So that
Yeah.
kind of, I think that spurred me into the paranormal more than anything, of facing my fears and saying, you're not doing this to me anymore, But I totally feel for you, hearing you say that back, and I'm thinking, yes, I know those
Yeah.
moments. And it can be even those moments that when you say them out loud to other people feel very, very small, but you remember the sheer terror
Mm.
of sitting in those moments, and it does stay with you, doesn't it? So bad,
It
so bad.
does. Yeah. I like I'm kind of envious really that you got to the stage to be like, I'm going to reclaim this
Mm,
for myself. And I feel like periodically I go through that. And I think by writing so much and going into sort of more dry academic stuff, that's kind of my way of processing it. It's like
definitely.
knowledge is a form of armor
Yeah.
almost. So I think maybe that's the way I'm dealing with it. But it's so strange because they're the sort of experiences that people go out every weekend and try and
Want.
experience,
Yeah.
aren't they? But I don't know about yeah, yeah. But I don't know about yourself, but when I think about paranormal experiences, I hold that in a completely separate box
Yes.
to anything I've experienced on an investigation, on like somewhere where I've been actively looking. Because investigations, I've seen people have their hair pulled. I've
Hmm.
had my hair pulled at the back, where my brilliant reaction to it was just suddenly becoming a ninja, as if I
Yeah.
know any form of martial art. It just one of the most embarrassing moments in my life. Um, but yeah, so those sort of things. Um, I find with a lot of paranormal investigations, a lot of ghost hunty
Hmm.
type things. I love watching people, and
Yes.
I seeing life far more like an airport departure lounge.
Hmm.
So I'll watch people, but oh, it's interesting language you're using. I'll sit here with my cup of tea in the back, going, "Yes, do, yes, yes, let's see what's happening." And so they probably just think, "Why the hell is she here?"
Hmm.
when she's just there with a little notebook going, yes. But I feel like I'm still getting quite a rewarding experience of that, even if I'm not running around in front with a REM pod saying I'm, you know, chatting with the devil.
Hmm.
But I've had my interesting moments. I like a lot of call and response stuff with
Yeah, yeah.
tech. I know it's all nowadays, there's a big school of thought towards a tech-free form of
Yeah.
investigation under the banner of authentic and Victorian, but come on now. Let's really think about what the Victorians did. Do you think they were all authentic?
Hmm.
Really? Oh,
Hmm.
that's interesting. But I do think tech has its place in the
Yeah.
paranormal. It always has. It always has. And so I do endorse to a point a lot of bleepy flashy because sometimes it's nice to think you're having a chat with a 17th century highwayman before you
Yeah.
go home and have
Yeah.
your Horlicks.
I mean, I'm sat on the fence about paranormal equipment, and
Mm,
I ebb and flow with it because I use more traditional. I find it too overloading a lot of the time.
yeah.
Lots of flashes and lots of beeps, and especially when
Mm,
you've got two talking, like the Alice box, or the Ovilus or whatever going off at the same time, and it's like
mm.
I can't
It's a
get
bit
into this.
much, yeah.
It is,
Yeah.
but for me, for when you get a sequential verification of communication, you get a number of bits of equipment that will go off either on command, or as part of a conversation. And
Mm,
I do find that fascinating. But going back to what you were saying about being on paranormal investigation and being able to put that in a separate box to your experiences in that house, I think
mm,
the overarching for me is that, it's almost like going to the pub. You go to the pub, you chat to strangers, don't you? You sort of talk to people you'd never talk to out on the street, but you wouldn't invite them back to your house. You wouldn't say,
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
come to my house for a drink. And I think that that's the difference. It's like when I'm on
Mm,
paranormal investigation, I definitely say, you guys are staying here. I'm happy to chat with you in this environment, but
mm,
you ain't coming home with me.
yeah.
This is in a pocket, because your house is your sanctuary, isn't it? It's the
Mm,
place where you should feel the safest. And if you've got stuff going off, it can be quite a scary thing.
yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And I think you just need one person to suggest something to you and say, it's interesting you've got that in your house. Won't it
mm,
attract da, 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 da? And then before you know it, your head's going, oh my
yes.
God, I've created a portal to hell, So
Yeah. Yeah,
yeah.
I think that there's a lot of that, isn't there? And that, I mean, there is that kind of school of thought that if you start thinking along those lines, that then you do create, you can create activity, even if it's on a psychological level. And yeah,
Mm.
it's not good. So I mean, talking about, let's talk about, because we are seriously running out of time. We've got about,
Oh,
I
I'm
don't know.
sorry. I'm so sorry.
I'm
I've just been
loving
waffling.
this. I'm absolutely loving this. I want to very much talk to you very, very briefly, because I want to talk about your new book. I'm fascinated about your new book. But very, very briefly. So people who are, Harry and the Hawthorne viewers are kind of paranormal 40 in, but more on the fairy side of things. And if they're looking at you going,
Mhm.
I know you from somewhere, um,
Yeah.
you are a TV celeb. You have been on
Oh, thank you.
you are you've been on telly with Jack Osborne, which
Mhm.
that must have been pretty surreal. Ozzy Osbourne's son,
Yeah.
that for a generation that's Ozzy
Yeah.
Osbourne's son. Tell
Yeah.
tell us very, very briefly about where people have maybe spotted you on the telly box.
Well, yeah. I did a series called Haunted Homecoming
Hmm.
with Jack Osborne. That was like arguably I did a documentary called Spectre or Spectacle before that, talking on Gothic literature.
Hmm.
But yeah, it was kind of a baptism of fire. That was my first big telly gig, and it was a three-part series where Jack and I investigated his house and places related to him and his house. So we're like where he went to the theatre, near where he went on school trips, and the pub where he and Ozzy often go for Sunday lunch. And so it was all places that were related to him.
Hmm.
And it was genuinely a wonderful experience. It was because everyone, I think having a team around you from Jack and his team and his family through to the crew and the camera crew, and everyone was so set on making this not just another cookie cutter paranormal show.
Yeah.
It was no, this is going to be, we're going for authenticity. If nothing happens, nothing happens. We've got plenty of interesting history, cutaways, and all the rest of it. So it seemed like everyone was on the same page
Hmm.
from the beginning. But it ended up being quite a popular show for Discovery, and it's been repeated on Really and God knows where else, Travel and Nat Geo, I think, many times, which has been quite nice.
Hmm.
Just flick on the telly and go, oh, Mum, look.
I'm here.
Um, yeah, yeah, look, I'm meant to be there as well. I haven't just broken in. So that was really nice. Yeah, it was a three-part series, and then after that, it's still available on Discovery Plus if you've got that app. And then I did Unexplained Caught on Camera,
Mm,
the last series of that, which was that was fun. That was
mm.
fun because they I think this is the problem when people book you and they say like, look, you just say what you're happy with. We're not going to tell you to say if anything's authentic or not, but it was basically like a pub quiz, test your knowledge, tell
Yeah,
us what you know about Wendigos. And I'm like,
yeah.
I've been training for this. But it was a lot of fun. That was a lot of fun. And I think I learned how to let people down slowly when commenting on
Yes,
clips
yes.
of mermaids and goblins and God knows what else. But that was fun because it's like You've Been Framed, but with ghosts.
That's a good
So
way
that
of
was
putting
fun.
it.
And I've got a
Right.
couple more things. It was really, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've got a couple more things filmed that are coming out next year. So that's quite exciting. That
Oh,
once again,
nice.
I've not just broken into production.
Yeah, just snuck
I'm
up and gone,
allowed to be
hello.
there. Yeah. Do you want to talk about ghosts? But yeah, so it's quite nice. I like doing that sort of thing. It feels like it's it's a way to present yourself, your interests, your research in some
Mm.
cases. And yeah, so I've enjoyed that a lot. And yeah, so maybe people will have seen me running around Ozzy Osbourne's house going, oh, that mirror's weird. So yeah.
Yep, so that's where you can find Kate on the telly box, on the goggle box. So if you have seen her now, you know. So I want to get on to, we've got about 10 minutes and I want to cram as much
Okay.
in about this new book. I don't think I'd seen you sort of do sort of a build up to this book. So when I saw you advertise it, I was like, oh,
Yeah.
brilliant, absolutely brilliant, because it was kind of out of nowhere. And I don't know whether
Mm.
I missed any of your build up to that, or
Nope.
tell us about the book. Tell us about how it started, what it's about. No spoilers,
Hmm.
of course.
Okay. Okay. Well, the book's called Begotten,
Hmm.
and it's basically it's like my love letter to Gothic novels,
Yeah.
70s schlocky paperback fiction,
Hmm.
and haunted house stories. So it's a story of family, secrets, intrigue, ghosts, and seance. So I think there's something for everyone in there.
Oh
But
yes.
yeah, it's ultimately like a gothic thrill ride about the the trustworthy nature of your senses.
Hmm.
And yeah, it follows the story of a woman returning home. This is in the 19th century, because of course
Yes,
I've
of
got
course.
to write a Victorian ghost story. And yes, it's and it's a story of a woman returning home after her father's death, finding that rather charismatic mediums appear to have taken control of her family. And so it's like the relationship that that family has with this new strange religion. Like suddenly she's back from a very, very glossy life, and the dining room's now holding seances for a dead father who's only just been buried. So it's I think it's a nice mix of gothic thrill ride and certainly quite a few horror elements.
Hmm.
But yeah, it's I'm very proud of it. I'm very proud of it. And I wrote it over a couple of years.
Hmm.
And yeah, I held on to the manuscript for quite a long time, thinking I should do something with it. I should have, because I've been focusing on writing a few substantial non-fiction things that are now I'm now having to really knuckle down on.
Hmm.
Um, and yeah, then I finally pushed for it and thought, no, I'm proud of this. I really want people to read it because I think it plugs a gap in the market as well, because we want haunted house stories, and we want gothic. We want the woman with fabulous hair running away from a
Hmm.
castle. I certainly do. I love those Avon paperbacks. But it just felt like I want that, but I want that with a bit of horror. I want it with a bit of grit.
Yeah.
And I want it with a little bit of humor in it as well. So I kind of wrote what I wanted to read, and based it in a lot of spiritualist truth, a lot of Victorian seance reports and things like that.
Was there any nerves about putting that out into the world? I know it's very different when you write something. For me, when I write something creatively, I find it much
Mhm.
more of a nervier process because it's like putting a massive chunk of yourself
Oh
out
yeah.
as opposed to
Yeah.
something more academic. So what spurred you on to get that out in the world and published?
I think it got to the phase where I felt like I needed to rip the plaster off in
Mm.
several areas of my life, because day to day I write short form non-fiction for a living. That's pretty much what I do. And just having this manuscript that I worked so hard on, that I believed in, but was held back because, oh, what if publishers don't like it? What if,
Mm.
what if it was just me wrapped up in my own head. So I'm absolutely terrified,
Mm.
really. about it, but I'm pretending that I'm not,
Yeah,
because then maybe that'll become my lived experience. Um, so yeah, it was a long period of time. But yeah, I've got it all wrapped up and it's up for pre-order now. So
hmm
if people want to pre-order Begotten by
hmm
Kate Cherrell, you can get it on Amazon, Waterstones, all over the place.
brilliant.
And it's out in May next year, the spookiest of months.
It
May,
is.
yeah.
It is. Yeah,
So it
Beltane.
will,
No, it is.
yeah,
Honestly, it's the time when the veil
yeah,
is
no,
thin.
Belton, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, it's perfect.
See,
Absolutely perfect.
perfect. So
I'll
consider it your Beltane present.
yeah, Beltane. It couldn't be better actually. Sort of a gothicy side of things, I think, for Beltane, because people forget that it is the Halloween for the other side of the world. They're
Mm,
they're celebrating Halloween and we're celebrating Beltane, and it is portal time. So yeah, that's quite fitting. That's quite fitting.
yeah.
Is it the 25th? Did I see it's the 25th of May next year?
Um, I no, I think it's the 13th of May,
Oh, it's got to have been.
2025.
It's got to have been the 13th with with that whole kind of
Yeah.
yeah. Is it a Friday? Let's hope it's a Friday. That would be even
I
better.
don't, oh, let's hope so. Let's hope so.
Let's just say it is. Let's just say it
Yeah,
is.
it
We'll
is
change.
Friday the 13th of May.
It is very
Oh,
spooky.
spooky.
Very
Yeah.
spooky. So, what's your future plans? What can you talk about? Where are things going? I know I've seen that you've got lots of different talks on, and
Yes.
you seem to be sort of bobbing up everywhere, which is absolutely brilliant in
Yeah.
different contexts with different subjects. So, what are you up
Yeah,
to?
I have many hats. Um yeah, so work-wise, like I said, I've got a couple of telly things out next year. I'm working on a long-form non-fiction, which is terrifying and quite fun.
Hmm
But talk-wise, I'm at the Festival of the Unexplained next month.
hmm
And I'm doing odd talk. Well, I've got my website. My website,
Oh
burialsandbeyond.com,
yes, yeah, yeah,
is like I've blogged on that page since 2017. So if you just want to read something about graveyards, memorial, legend, ghost story, let me fill the 5 minutes of time you have spare on your commute. But also on that, I have my talks and events page.
yeah.
So I try and keep that super updated. But I'm doing several different talks all over the Midlands into, yeah, it's Midlands, a little bit into the northeast and a little bit into the southwest
hmm
this year. I've been trying to slow down, but that's best intentions and all that. So yeah, the next big festival is Festival of the Unexplained.
hmm
And I have a Patreon, which is patreon.com/burials and beyond.
hmm
And I update that multiple times a week with new content, whether it's articles, podcasts, videos. So that's kind of the people, if they want to join my little community of very, very nice weirdy folk. So there's loads of stuff. There's like deep dives into cemeteries, and also I'm bringing back Loopholes, that your good self appeared on the last
Yes,
series.
yes, I enjoyed that.
The podcast I do with Ian Boldsworth. We have a podcast called Loopholes, where we take a sideways look at the
hmm
esoteric, and just tackle various other topics and get really interesting guests on. I'm generally quite interested and more maybe sympathetic to a lot of these topics, whereas Ian is a very, very lovely, very, very patient skeptic who is also incredibly funny.
hmm
So together we're a little pincer movement through the esoteric, and we've got a really lovely fan base. And I think we've got about 50, 60 episodes behind us. So if
Wow.
people want to catch up on that, that's you can find that just called the Loopholes podcast. You can find that anywhere. So lots of fun self-generated stuff
hmm
this year, and then more big scary stuff next year.
Big scary stuff
That's my
sounds
plans.
good.
Yeah.
That sounds good. Yeah, I like to say I do keep you seeing you pop up, and you've been to this graveyard and this graveyard, and then you're doing this talk and this
Yeah.
talk, and you just seem yeah everywhere. So you're saying you're slowing down. It doesn't look like it at all.
I'm trying to. I'm trying to, but I do love my lecturing. I do love my talks. I'm doing them all over the place about
Mm.
all manner of spooky and miserable stuff. I do a lot on Victorians,
Mhm.
miserable Victorians. So Also, if anyone can't make those, they're all recorded and on my Patreon. Da, 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 da. And
Yay!
it's as cheap as £1 a month. I mean, that's like nowadays,
It's
that's like what the
nothing.
cost of a Freddo. I mean, come on.
Exactly. Good grief.
Yeah.
You know, when you go
Mm,
into the shop nowadays and you see stuff and you think, you've got to be kidding. What
yeah.
happened?
When
What?
Space Raiders aren't 10p. Disgusting.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. The world's just gone to pot. Absolutely gone
It
to
really
pot.
has. Yeah.
So on that note, I want to thank you so, so much. I could have, I really could have carried on all the things that we've talked about. I could have carried on for hours chatting with you about them. And I'd love to have you back at some point to really unbox some themes and get into the nitty gritty.
Oh,
Um,
definitely. Yeah.
I do want to have a chat with you about fairies at some stage as well, because I'd love to know your views on that subject, because that's obviously
Oh, happily.
close to my
Yeah.
heart. So love to get you back at some point and yeah, and have a chat about things. So if you want to go and find Kate, please do. Are you across all social media?
Yeah.
Facebook,
On
Twitter,
Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, I'm at Burials and Beyond pretty much everywhere. And
yeah.
on Instagram, I am All My Own Teeth
I
and
noticed
also
that
Burials and
today and I
Beyond.
was like,
Yeah.
that's a brilliant catch. That is
So
absolutely
I
brilliant.
can't get rid of it now. It's I've taken it to heart. So you can find me on Instagram there. I put loads of little short form videos up now of weird graves and legends and things. Yeah,
Yeah,
nice mix.
that made me smile when I saw that. I was like, I like that. I do like that.
Thank you.
So go and find Kate, go and support her work. And if you like things that are all gothic, I know some of you out there will absolutely love that kind of side of things as well. So go and follow her work and see what she's up to. And she's absolutely fascinating to listen to, giving talks about various different subjects. So like I say, I saw her at Parameet this year, and I was totally enthralled, talking about Poundland Ouija boards, which
Yes.
is another thing that we should talk about. I really want to have a chat with you in
Oh
the
yes.
future about that,
Yeah.
and sort of about
Mm.
ethics as well, and that kind of thing. I'd be
Yeah.
fascinated to hear your views on that. So, okay, so before we get into another topic and end up with another hour's worth of this, I'm going to say thank you very much, and I will speak to you soon.